the bell tolled at dawn. It began as a single slow note, round and deep, that rolled across the village like someone breathing while asleep. It was the sort of sound that reaches into the covers and makes a bed warmer for a moment, not startling, not desperate, merely present. People rose in their houses and went to windows, not because they feared, but because they recognized the bell as an old friend with something to say. This bell belonged to St. Eadmar's Tower, a squat stonework of weathered ashlar that had washed the lanes for 300 winters. It had rung for weddings and funerals, for harvest, blessed and seasons turned. Its timbre was familiar enough that the miller could measure a loaf's baking time by a single stroke. On that morning, though there was no bell ringer in the tower, the first to tell the tale was Hilda, who kept the bakery by the lane. She told it in a voice that folded her hands like dough. "Careful, patient. I heard it at first light," she said, soft as flour on a board. "I fetcha." D, a loaf from the oven, and sat by the window thinking old Osmond must be at his post. But when Osmond came, he came by the back gate with flour on his shoes and said he had not been up the tower all night. Neighbours checked approaches as one might check for a friendly guest. The watchman Martin walked the stones and saw no boot prints that led to the tower steps. The ladder that ran within the tower was clean. The rope that once hung over the parapet for hoisting wooden bells was knotted. The tower door itself was latched from inside, and inside the lantern lay cold and unlit. Yet the bell had tolled deep and clear, rolled over roofs and thatch and fields like an old hymn on a wind with no name. People began to recount smaller details, the kind that make stories breathe. A widow Marek swore that when the bell sounded she felt a warmth settle in her chest the way a wrapped cloak warms shoulders, and that she dreamed of her brother's laugh the whole day after. A child said the bell had seemed Ed to call her name, though she could not remember which name it had used, and did not care to say why the bell's voice felt like home. A fisherman noticed his nets left the night before in a careless heap laid neatly as if someone had folded them during the tolling. None of these things read as omens. They read in the strange language of villages as the world quietly setting itself right. Monks from the abbey took up the matter with a certain clerical calm. D, a short note in the margin of his book. On the third day of the month the bell rang at dawn, though none were there to ring. He did not mark it with alarm, but with an extra line of ink, a small cross that later generations would point to as if it were a signature. The abbot ordered a vigil. A party climbed the tower at sunrise with keys and torches. They found nothing out of order. The bell rope had not been pulled, but the bell lay warm where the patina should have held the night's chill, as if it had recently been touched by hand or by something that did not need hands at all. Stories like this thrive in the narrow spaces between things that people expect and things they cannot yet name. They are not the grand gestures of kings or the thunderclap of war. They live in the quiet margin where a life's crooked seam might be mended. The villagers talked of saints and of small miracles, of the difference between a sign and a coincidence. Some suggested that the bell's toll might be a message from the abbey, its guardian saint, a reminder to keep faith bright on a cold morning. Others, fewer and spoken only in the warmth of an inn's corner, said perhaps the bell had simply had a dream of being rung and shared it with the waking world. The bell continued to toll, not every dawn, not every day, once a week after that first morning, and then more rarely, and once much later on a night when the moon kept itself shy behind cloud. The bell tolled 3 times in a slow measured sequence that left listeners with the age of a hand counting beads. Each time it tolled, small tender things would happen in the village: a debt erased by a neighbor's quiet generosity, a sow finally giving birth to a single healthy piglet after months of worry, a woman finding a letter sewn into an old quilt, an apology written in a hand that had not been seen for decades. It is easy to mock this pattern from outside, to say people sought meaning and found it, but such reassurance misses the color of the days that followed. Whether or not the bell rang by miracle, the village began to tune itself to a different rhythm, a rhythm that made space for unexpected kindnesses and sudden mercies, and in a world where certainties were thin, that new rhythm mattered. What was the source of this benevolent tolling? Some answers the chronicles and whispered tales offered, others belong to the silences where oral memory lives. One elder Wilfred, whose feet had walked the lane for near 80 winters, told of an old vow his grandmother kept, the Tower K. Eps its own, she had said, meaning that towers and their stones can remember oaths. Wilfred's grandmother had been a midwife, and once in a night of frost had prayed the bell's keepers to let a child live. That child's mother went on to keep a candle for the tower each solstice. Stories like these create a lattice of obligation and gratitude that stretches across generations. A tower's bell in a community's mind might owe to that lattice something beyond sound. Other tales were older and folded into the land, escaped like roots. There were stories of the bell being a kind of witness. On nights when it sounded by itself, older folk would tell the bell was said to stir at the remembering of a wrong righted. Once a man rumored to have cheated a wandering craftsman of a fair wage went before the abbot and returned the money quietly late, as if answering some inner chime. When the bell sounded thereafter, neighbors said the village felt the tension ease like a taut rope finally slackening. Whether the bell literal, lie new, or whether people gathered reasons to act is a question historians might debate in the warm half-light of the present. It was enough that the bell's toll made the writing possible. Of course, there were skeptics. A traveling merchant, smooth and practical, told anyone who would listen that bells can be set to toll by clockwork or by clever contrivance, and that superstition makes poets of the poor. The blacksmith, a practical man with arms like iron bands, took a rope up the tower one evening, and felt nothing but rope and stone. The rope moved when he tugged it. It did not move on its own. He shrugged and swore the bell had been wind or rust or the ample work of mice. The village was old enough to accept multiple truths alongside Brother Aldwin's chronicle and Hilda's bread with a blacksmith's sober hands and the merchant's sharp laugh. These contradictions made the story richer rather than poorer, as if many hands were knitting the same cloth. One dawn in late autumn, after 3 years of occasional ringing, the bell tolled with a particular urgency. It rang not like a single friendly voice, but like a chorus, and the sound held a cadence that made the hair along the nape of the neck stand in polite attention. Men and women in their beds felt the pull to leave their doors open to place a light on their sills. A child who had been ill for months walked, the pallor still near in his cheeks, to the doorway, and for the first time in days laughed at something only he could see: the abbot read lawn. Psalms that morning, more like hope than prayer. Neighbors lingered on thresholds and helped each other in small essential ways. Firewood shared, soup ladled, a cart lent for a neighbor's journey. After that autumn, tolling, the abbey's chronicler discovered a note in an old ledger, a faded scroll that had not been there before. It read in a cramped hand, "Remember the debt of the widow." The ledger itself had been kept tidy for decades, every entry a neat account of grain and coin. This new note had no ledge, heir number, no account to match it. The abbot convened a council and looked into records. There had been a widow once years before whose son had died at sea and whose small plot of land had been claimed by a cousin, no law undone, the cousin's taking. Still, the ledger's ghostly note seemed to reopen accounts that had been closed. The cousin, a man whose family had prospered in the meantime, returned a small field to the widow's house with a quiet apology, explaining later that he had dreamt of a bell. And a woe. Man who knitted something that needed returning, whether his conscience had been stirred by sound or by the soft pressure of village memory. The field came back. The bell had in effect nudged an action that bent toward fairness. The years that passed settled the bell into the village's pattern like a tide finding its grooves. Travelers mentioned the bell in passing as they passed through, speaking of it as one might mention a good inn. Practical, comforting, appreciated poets fewer, but practiced at such things penned lines about a bell that rings for the forgotten and put the village on a map of hushed wonders. Children grew up with the bell as background music to their childhoods, as natural as the river's murmur. Weddings included a nod to the bell, with a couple leaving a loaf at the abbey door in thanks. Funerals included a gentle hope that if the bell called out a faint note in the morning, those within might be remembered kindly. We might then ask a quick question: was the bell a miracle, a trick? Of sound and psychology, a series of coincidences knit together by the human desire for meaning. The old village made room for all these answers without splitting itself apart. In their telling, the bell was as mechanical and as sacred as a plow that turns earth, a tool and also a witness. To them, the bell's tolls were an invitation to live better, a small social mechanism that pushed toward kindness. In a world where suffering was ordinary and remedies thin, any nudge, whether from rope, from memory, or from something older, was a marvel. Toward the end of our story, we step back to the tower itself. Stone is patient in small ways. It remembers frost and sun and the hands that dressed it. If you climb the worn steps today, you'll see nothing to explain the bell's occasional calls, no hidden pulley, no secret bell ringer. You will see only rope stained with years of hands and a bell with a lip worn smooth by its own voice. And if you listen in early light, you might notice that the bell's sound is not only light, you might notice that the bell's sound is not only light, you might notice that the bells, but the villages, a complex chord made of wooden doors opening the low reply of a distant dog, a child's footfall, the fold of a cloak. The bell is not separate from the world it lives in, it is stitched into it like thread through a seam. So the bell continues to toll now and then, some mornings, some evenings without fanfare. It calls the living to small acts of care, reminds neighbors of their shared ledgers, and keeps a habit of kindness alive. Hilda's bread still cools by her window. The widow keeps a candle at her sill. Brother Aldwin's chronicle fills another margin and another, and the abbey keeps a record of small wonders filed between grain accounts. New travelers still ask about the bell when they pass through, and the miller still times his baking by a bell stroke when he can find one. If you listen closely at dawn, you may hear it, and if you do, notice how you feel lighter, steadier, slightly more at ease. It is a subtle thing, this kind of miracle, not a thunderclap, not a defiant sign, W. Phil, written in the sky, but a small sound that offers people a chance to be better neighbors for the length of a bell's long note. In a long world where small kindnesses are easily forgotten, that ringing is no less than a salvation.